morning. Man, it's a cold morning this morning. But I had to take a video of my beautiful pine tree with the beautiful sun coming up on it. It's only like 6 degrees this morning. It's really cold. I want to do another, welcome to the Backyard Professor Chess videos. I want to do another game of Bobby Fischer against, this was in the candidates match in 1971. He was playing Tigran Petrosian. This game, what is it that made Bobby Fischer so good? This game doesn't have a lot of flash and verve, fantastic rook sacrifices or anything, but it's just solid. And so I want to show you this to give us some encouragement of maybe perhaps if we were to do something like this, we could play like this eventually with an awful lot of practice. Petrosian does the Sicilian, and Fischer plays the Sicilian really well. He had to, because he usually opened up with the Pawn King 4 the vast majority of times when Fischer played. He would open with the Pawn King 4 move, as we all know now. Pawn Queen 4, pawn take pawn, knight takes the pawn, and now pawn Queen Rook 3, preventing the bishop from coming up here and hitting his king. Perhaps Bishop Queen 3, a very good speedy development. Knight Queen Bishop 3, following right along. And now Fischer takes the knight. Very interesting. This variation against the Sicilian, the text says, introduced by Paul Morphy more than a century ago. So Paul Morphy definitely influencing Fischer. But it actually got Spassky nowhere in his 1969 World Championship match with Petrosian, and now we see Fischer doing the same thing. So Petrosian is familiar with this idea in the Sicilian. Fischer did not introduce something new that Petrosian was not aware of, and Fischer castles, and Petrosian putting the pawn to Queen 4, rather than taking the pawn at this point and then letting black return the pawn, Fischer bumped up his Queen Bishop pawn also. So the fight is for the central pawns. Petrosian comes to Knight Bishop 3, and now Fischer initiates the taking of the pawns so that it will saddle Petrosian with an isolated queen pawn. And the pawn exchanges, and the pawn exchanges, and the pawn exchanges. Petrosian is left with the very difficult to defend isolated queen pawn, which Fischer immediately hits, and Petrosian already has it covered at this point, though. His bishop is obscuring his queen from hitting it at this point, but he's making sure he's going to keep pressure on it in one way or another, and so at this point it's the queen and the knight that are protecting that pawn. So Petrosian has his bases covered, is what I'm saying, and this gives Fischer a chance, bringing out another piece, hitting the bishop with check. The idea, they say, is to centralize the queen after bishop queen 2, then queen goes to queen 4. And so he has a very nice, strong central position. Petrosian, however, brings up the queen instead of the bishop over. Petrosian would just as soon change out queens, in other words. Now, Petrosian has been described as a python, one who just slowly squeezes you And I mean, he was world champion at one point. This is not mamby-pamby chess by any means. So this is an interesting idea here. And queen, queen 2. Notice Fischer does not contend with the queens yet. He brings his rook first on an open file straight across from Petrosian's king. That's more important to him positionally than worrying about whether his queen is on the board or not. Petrosian does exchange the queen. He takes the queen. Fischer takes the queen with his knight. And now the bishop comes up to king 3. Good, solid, strong central development. Bishop comes up to king 3. Good, strong central development. And now Petrosian castles. So, I mean, this candidates match is a really well systematic build-up of a game for both defense and offense. Now, he wants to exchange bishops, the dark squared bishops. Interesting. Petrosian will guard his bishop. Fischer will take the bishop. Petrosian will take the bishop. And once that bishop moves, he will be contesting the open file. Pawn to queen knight 4. He fixes the queen rook pawn so that he can have a target later on. That was the purpose of this pawn thrust. King comes up to bishop 1. He wants to bump a little bit more into the center, and he wants to give a little bit more support to both his rook and pawn. It's good to contact all of the pieces, make sure it's a nice, tight, hardcore group. Knight goes to the outpost, of course, hitting the bishop, of course. This is good chess. Just systematically improving their positions. That's what we see both of these players doing. And bishop comes back to bishop 1. And now pawn bumps up to bishop 3, trying to support this square, keeping the knight at bay in case there's an excursion against his king. The file is open now, and there could be some really interesting fireworks, except Petrosian comes over to the rook file instead. There's a lot of comments that black should have exchanged the rooks. It probably would have been better. Fischer comes up to rook king 5. If you're in an open file, use an open file. You notice who now has the open file in this game, and notice that once Petrosian gave up control of the file, Fischer immediately made use of it. This is really important for us to grasp how to do this. He uses the open file. Now bishop comes up to queen 2 because he wants to come to here. Man, if he can get his bishop to here, it's a whole new game for Petrosian. He breaks through and has the attack. Right? That makes lots of sense. So he bumps his bishop back up to here. Fischer, of course, sees this, and so he must take the bishop and go check with the knight. Now the question is, do you respond with the knight taking or the rook taking? The knight is somewhat limited unless he comes to here and then bumps into here, or he goes to here and then bumps into here, sacrificing himself. But there's nothing else. We don't have a lot of attacking pieces, so the question is, how did he retake? He took with the rook. This also gives support for his central pawn. And now rook comes to queen bishop 1. Once again, the other open file and Fischer puts his rook on that open file. So Fischer owns and uses both of the open files in this game. Very interesting to see. Rook comes up to queen 3. The problem Petrosian is facing now is that he can't guard both of his 6th rank, 7th ranks, or 8th ranks. Fischer has access to Petrosian, but Petrosian does not have access to Fischer. So Petrosian is more on the defense, Fischer is more on the offense. Okay, and that's the difference in this game from here on out. Because now he can take over the 7th rank. And Petrosian is kind of in a hard way here. He tries to shut down the influence of that rook going across the 7th rank. His other rook bumps down here to king 2 because it's important to keep this file being threatened by the knight rather than take the knight and lose the rook, which is what some amateurs, probably like me, would have done, although I don't think I would have. So he's just playing. This is one of those where there isn't a better move to move, and so you do need to react to your opponent's threat, find the best square, maintain. Because of the nature of this position, yes, the bishop's hitting up here. He could get some kind of a kingside if he desired. If he bumped over to here, Fischer apparently thought that it would be better, instead of trying to induce weaknesses of the pawns, to maintain his control of the open files. So there's kind of a nifty little idea for us to keep in mind in our games. The great Bobby Fischer believed the open files were more important than a direct attack on the king, which technically can't happen anyway. Either here or here. There's not a lot of coordination of pieces to go at the king side at this point anyway. Does that make sense? So he has a wonderful feather in his cap with both open files, the only 2 open files, and he owns them both. So it makes sense that he retreats. It makes sense at this point that he does react to his opponent's threat. You know, in other videos I've shown, sometimes you can ignore your opponent's threats. In this case, you can't, but it doesn't lose you any extra positional advantage to react to those threats. He maintains the open file. I know I'm blowing on and on and on about this, but it's seriously one of the great critical features of all of the chess giants that we are aware of, that they keep the files and they use them. I can't over-exaggerate that. There is no way to over-exaggerate that because of the open files. Anyway, Petrosian is forced to weaken his kingside somewhat, just in case he needs an escape square, right? So there you have it. Well, the king comes up to bishop 2, and the pawn goes up to king rook 4. Now he's just simply pushing forward his pawns to reach a more favorable endgame position, right? And Fischer comes up pawn bishop 4. And he even keeps pushing pawn rook 5. He's going to go just as far up as he can in this endgame. He is suspecting that he's trying to get a good endgame feature because of those two files. Oh, and then my heater turned on. Hold on, I'll put it on pause. We're right at the end of the good game. I'll be right back. Yikes. Okay, where was I before I was so rudely interrupted by my own blessed furnace, which I love because it's only 5 degrees this morning. So, at this position, what the text says is white has a stranglehold on the position, and so he can now actively provoke further pawn weaknesses. Notice, Petrosian, because of the pawn, the isolated pawn, one of his rooks is stuck with defending it. His other rook is stuck defending his rook pawn. Therefore, Fischer has the more active play. And it's interesting that he's never even blockaded that pawn, isn't it? He hasn't had to worry about blockading the pawn. He can be indirectly attacking it and thus produce more weaknesses in the rest of the pawn structure, mostly over here is what he wants to focus on, because these 3 pawns are together and these 3 pawns are together. In an endgame, it could be kind of drawish if they're not careful. Fischer was not willing to do a draw at all if he could help it. He wanted to win. And that is one of the big keys for Fischer. What made him great is his desire to win. It's an attitude we could incorporate, right? Yeah. So let's see how Fischer handles this. King, Bishop 3. Bring your king up into the center. Technically, for all intents and purposes, we're enough toward the end game, but remember, Fischer can actively produce more pawn weaknesses. The king is a fighting unit in the end game. Activate him. Put him in there. Sure, that makes beautiful sense. And now pawn, bishop 4. He's bringing the pawns up to try to prevent Fischer from getting up here in the center. He's inducing weaknesses. Fischer is active. King, king 3. Notice how he's doing this. Now the pawn advances to put the check onto the king, and the king bumps down to here. So, very interesting. Now, knight comes to knight 3, and rook 2 to king 7. Yowzer! 7th rank domination, man. Directly, now you can see who has the power here. Really. The consequent of Fischer's pieces being more active and stronger than Petrosian's, those rooks are vastly superior to Petrosian's for one reason: the open files. Again, the consequence of playing like a grandmaster would gives you much greater power. Always worth seeing again and again and again and again. I can't emphasize this enough. In fact, I know that one of my very favorite internet chess teachers, Ben Feingold, he also shows open files in games when they occur, and he comments on them also, just like I'm doing. Not that I'm near as good as him. He is light years beyond me. But this principle is fundamental. When we play chess using open files on our rooks, we greatly improve the power of our games. End of discussion. There can be no argument against that. Not that's legitimate that I'm aware of. So, this is really cool to see how it works. And that it works. Every time. Knight comes back to queen 4. Rook, bishop 7, check, of course. King to king 1. Notice he had threatened the rooks, forked them technically, truly, and yet they are not harmed. Because he has the power. This is called pigs on the 7th. You are now seeing why pigs on the 7th is so powerful, because they can get out of cool little forks that thrown at them by checking the king always. It's a beautiful coordination of rooks. And now the knight takes the knight pawn. Once again, going to exchange the minor pieces perhaps. We don't know. In either case, Fischer says, no, I don't even want to exchange the minor pieces to a rook endgame because those end up somewhat drawish. But here, Fischer has the power, and this is where Petrosian resigned. The issue here is it will help illustrate the power of the rooks through the open files to dominate the opponent's 7th rank, even against a greater one as Petrosian. And here's why. Because there's nothing stopping him from going here now. And of course, checkmate next move. That's the power of pigs on the 7th when you get both of them there. So this is exquisitely excruciating. An attempt, perhaps, is knight to d5. And then, of course, the rook wants to go to h7. But now we can do rook to d7. And yes, it's a desperate move. At this point, black would be attempting to not get checkmated, so he's going to lose material. This is the power of pigs on the 7th, right? And now with this rook, takes that rook, and now you've got the knight f6. So the knight can come back into the defense somewhat. But then rook e7, check. King comes to d7, and now you can't bring your other rook, either rook, to here because of the knight. So that was a pretty good defense. So, threaten the knight. Right? Knight can come down here to e4, check. Bump the king down to d1, which isn't a big deal. And now knight to d6, forking both the rooks again, trying to get somehow a single rook instead of both. But then you have rook f8. And the only thing you can do is put your knight in front of it. And now you can bring your bishop up to f7. Ouch. You're beginning to see the effects of the power of the open files and pigs on the 7th, aren't you? It's a really good feature to know. So if king came to c8 to threaten the rook here, then the rook can come to e7. And for all intents and purposes, it's over. It doesn't matter what you can do here or here. It doesn't matter. Instead of that move, if you go to here, it's irrelevant. He's got checkmate. So what made Fischer so great? One, the untold, unknown, unseen thousands of hours, thousands of days he spent studying and playing the game. But the second thing is he adhered to basic chess principles. Yes, he was fabulous with tactics, there's no question. But his basic chess principles was control of the center and rooks on open files. Seriously. And when you get them on open files, you use them. And the new principle that this game illustrates so well is once you have rooks on open files, it is extremely strong to get those rooks together on the opponent's 7th rank, because then the attack is exquisitely overwhelming. So there's your chess game today. Hope you're having a great holiday season. New Year's is coming up, so remember, resolutions are coming to the brains of us, and we want to find out what are our chess resolutions. Let's be thinking for the next couple of days, and I'll reveal mine on New Year's Day on what I want to accomplish in this next year of chess. So, have a great day. Be good, do well, have fun. Thanks. You know, be nice. Make the world a better place than when you found it. And I will see you in the next video. Yes.